Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow.
On May 23, 1934, 6 lawmen crouched in roadside brush along Highway 154 in Louisiana, waiting before dawn for a stolen Ford V8 to round the bend. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had spent 2 years robbing their way across the country, humiliating every posse sent after them. It took a betrayal from a man they trusted to finally give up their route, and that tip is what put 6 rifles waiting in the dark, patience finally running out.
When the Ford rolled into range, there was no warning shot and no order to surrender. For 16 straight seconds, automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols tore into the car without pause. It was struck more than 1,000 times. Bonnie and Clyde died instantly, still belted into their seats. A coroner who later examined the wreckage of their bodies said the damage was so extensive that embalming fluid simply would not stay inside them.
Al Capone ruled Chicago's bootlegging empire through calculated terror, and nothing announced it louder than the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 rival gangsters lined against a garage wall and executed on his orders. He was Scarface, untouchable, the man blamed for every body that turned up in the city. But the empire didn't end in a shootout. It ended quietly, eaten from the inside by a disease he had refused to treat for years.
By 1947, untreated syphilis had rotted Capone's mind down to the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. The man who once ordered massacres from a distance could no longer follow a simple conversation with his own family. On January 25th, he suffered a stroke, then cardiac arrest, and died in bed at his Miami estate, surrounded by relatives instead of rivals. No bullets, no sirens, just a once brilliant mind giving out in total silence.
Albert Anastasia earned the nickname Lord High Executioner, running the crew known as Murder Incorporated. But by the mid-1950s, his own organization had quietly turned against him. He was selling Mafia memberships for cash, racking up gambling debts he couldn't cover, and acting recklessly enough that his own underboss, Carlo Gambino, began secretly negotiating with rival families about having him permanently removed from power. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia sat down for a shave in a Manhattan barbershop, hot towels covering his face, completely blind to the room around him. 2 gunmen walked in calmly and opened fire without a word. Witnesses said he lunged instinctively at their reflections in the mirror before his legs finally gave out beneath him, and he collapsed dead on the floor, still wrapped in the barber's sheet, blood pooling across the tile.
The hit worked exactly as it was planned. With Anastasia gone, Carlo Gambino, the very man who had helped arrange his death behind closed doors, stepped smoothly into control of the family that would carry his name for the next 2 decades. A routine haircut turned into a coronation, and the underworld barely paused long enough to notice the quiet transfer of an entire empire from one man to another.
Bugsy Siegel had built Las Vegas out of raw desert, but his partners in the National Syndicate watched the Flamingo Hotel run $6 million over its original budget, while he lived lavishly off their invested money. Patience in that world was never infinite, and by 1947, the very men who had financed his glittering vision had quietly decided the visionary himself had become the problem that needed solving.
On a summer night that year, Siegel sat on a chintz sofa in his girlfriend's Beverly Hills living room, reading the evening edition of the Los Angeles Times. A gunman outside fired through the window using a military rifle. One round struck Siegel's left eye directly and threw it clean 15 feet across the room. He never saw the shot coming, and neither did audiences decades later who watched that same haunting image restaged on screen.
Carmine Galante clawed his way toward control of the powerful Bonanno crime family, but his open ambition made him far too dangerous for rivals to let live much longer. In 1979, competing factions decided the only reliable way to stop his rise was to end it at the exact table where he sat down for lunch nearly every single day of the week, treating that predictable, unguarded routine as a fatal weakness rivals had simply been waiting to exploit. Gunmen walked calmly into a Brooklyn restaurant during the lunch rush and shot Galante through the chest and head without hesitation. He died instantly, slumped over in his chair at the table. When police arrived at the scene, they found his trademark cigar still clenched firmly between his teeth, the same cigar he had smoked through decades of clawing toward a throne he would ultimately never live to sit on.
Sam Giancana had run Chicago's outfit for years and, according to persistent rumors that never fully died, brushed shoulders with the CIA in shadowy plots against Fidel Castro's Cuba.
By 1975, federal investigators wanted him back in the country to testify before Congress about decades of buried operations, and the very men he once commanded decided a talking Giancana was worth far more to them dead than alive and free to negotiate for himself. He was in his own basement kitchen frying sausages and peppers late one night when someone he trusted completely walked in quietly behind him. A single shot to the back of the head dropped him instantly to the floor. Then 6 more rounds followed in a deliberate ring around his mouth, a silent, unmistakable message to anyone else in the organization who might be considering cooperating with the government the way he had.
Tony Spilotro ran Las Vegas enforcement for the Chicago outfit, skimming casino money and building a reputation for violence so extreme it embarrassed even the bosses who employed him. He'd gone rogue, drawing heavy federal heat, and by 1986, the outfit decided he and his brother Michael had become liabilities, requiring permanent, quiet removal before either man dragged the whole organization down.
He was lured to a quiet Indiana farmhouse under the false promise of a promotion within the organization. Instead, he and his brother were beaten with fists and boots inside the basement until both men stopped moving entirely. Investigators later found sand deep in Tony's lungs, grim evidence that he had still been breathing and drawing air when his killers buried him alive in a nearby Indiana cornfield alongside his brother.
That double murder, later dramatized in the film Casino, effectively ended the Chicago outfit's decades-long grip on Las Vegas. Corporate casinos and public companies moved in where the mob had once quietly ruled every counting room in every casino on the Strip, and the entire era of skimming millions from the desert closed the moment Spilotro's body finally went into the ground beside his own brother's body.
Pablo Escobar built the Medellin cartel into the wealthiest criminal enterprise the world had ever seen. But by 1993, his own network was collapsing in on itself. Rivals, the Colombian government, and a shadow paramilitary task force called Los Pepes were closing in from every direction at once, and the men who once protected him at all costs were disappearing, defecting, or quietly turning informant.
On December 2nd, radio surveillance finally triangulated a phone call to a modest house in Medellin. Escobar tried desperately to run across the terracotta rooftops barefoot, and Colombian special forces shot him cleanly in the back and the head. Photographs of celebrating officers standing triumphantly over his corpse circled the entire globe within just a few hours of his death being confirmed by radio. Officially, Escobar died in a gunfight he simply couldn't win against overwhelming numbers. His family has always maintained a very different version of events, that in his final desperate seconds, cornered and completely out of options, he turned a gun on himself rather than let the men below capture him alive. Either way, the world's most powerful cartel effectively died on that rooftop right along with him. James Whitey Bulger spent 16 years as a fugitive after it emerged he had secretly informed for the FBI for years while simultaneously running Boston's brutal Winter Hill Gang. In 2018, at 89 years old, prison officials made a decision that read almost like a death sentence, transferring the newly exposed informant directly into general population at a West Virginia federal facility full of men who despised what he had done.
He lasted less than 12 hours inside those walls. Inmates cornered him almost immediately and beat him mercilessly with a padlock stuffed inside a sock, a weapon as old as prison violence itself. In keeping with the mob's oldest and most brutal punishment reserved for informants, his attackers attempted to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue before guards ever discovered his body lying in the cell.
The killing sent a message that outlived Bulger himself by decades. Informants, however powerful or protected they once were, do not get to simply disappear quietly into old age. 16 years of federal protection and careful hiding meant absolutely nothing once he was finally locked in a room with men who remembered exactly what he had done to their friends and to their families in the years before he vanished.
Paul Castellano ran the Gambino family from a sprawling mansion, far removed from the street soldiers he technically commanded, and his hands-off, businessman style bred deep resentment among the ranks. Chief among the resentful was John Gotti, a rising captain who believed Castellano's caution was strangling both the family's earning power and his own ambitions for control of the entire operation.
In December 1985, during the busy Christmas shopping rush outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, gunmen dressed in matching trench coats stepped calmly out and shot Castellano down on the crowded sidewalk in front of stunned witnesses. John Gotti watched the entire execution unfold from a parked car directly across the street, close enough to personally confirm the job had been finished exactly as he ordered it.
Gotti's enormous gamble paid off completely. He seized control of the Gambino family within days and became known as the Teflon Don, acquitted case after case in court, photographed in tailored $1,000 suits, seemingly untouchable by the very same justice system that had successfully jailed or killed every single rival boss who had ever come before him in the family's long, bloody history of leadership. That carefully built image collapsed entirely once he was finally convicted and sent away for life without parole. The same man who had orchestrated a public execution on a crowded Manhattan sidewalk didn't die in a blaze of gunfire himself. In 2002, throat cancer killed him slowly instead, in a prison hospital bed, stripped completely of the power and legend that had once made him seem invincible. Joe the Boss Masseria held the title of Boss of Bosses throughout the brutal Castellammare's War, but his own trusted lieutenant, Lucky Luciano, had secretly decided the entire old structure of Italian mob hierarchy needed to end for good, and that Masseria's sudden death was simply the necessary price of forcing that lasting change on an organization still stuck in its own violent and outdated past.
In 1931, Luciano invited Masseria out to lunch at a quiet Coney Island restaurant, then calmly excused himself to use the restroom. The moment he stepped away from the table, gunmen, including Albert Anastasia and Bugsy Siegel, walked in together and shot Masseria dead in his chair, at the very same table where he'd been happily eating a plate of food just seconds before the door swung open behind him.
That single arranged lunch ended the entire Castellammare's War almost overnight. Luciano used the sudden peace to dismantle the old, rigid boss of bosses system completely, replacing it instead with the Commission, a governing board of crime families built to share power evenly among the bosses and outlast every single man who would ever sit on it in the many decades that followed his own violent death.
Salvatore Maranzano won that same bloody war and immediately claimed the title Boss of Bosses for himself, but he lasted only a few short months in power. He was already quietly drawing up a list of rivals to eliminate next, including Luciano himself, when Luciano's own men moved first to protect the fragile new order they had only just finished building together in secret before it could be undone in a single afternoon.
Gunmen disguised as ordinary tax agents walked casually into Maranzano's Manhattan office in September of 1931. They stabbed and shot him at his own desk without warning, ending his brief reign before he ever got the chance to act on the bloody purge he had secretly planned. Luciano's commission, born directly out of Masseria's death, had just survived its very first real test, only weeks after it was first quietly formed.
Lucky Luciano spent his final years exiled in Italy after being formally deported from the United States, still considered one of the most wanted architects of organized crime anywhere in the world. Italian authorities, tipped off to his continuing business dealings back in the United States, were actively closing in once again to arrest him for good, decades after he first built the commission from nothing. In 1962, he suffered a sudden heart attack inside the busy Naples airport, collapsing in a crowded public terminal just as agents moved in to finally take him back into custody. The man who built the commission and reshaped the entire American Mafia forever died mid-transit, caught forever between one departing flight home to America and an arrest that, in the end, never actually happened to him at all.
Not every ending made screaming headlines. Dutch Schultz spent his final hours strapped to a hospital bed, rambling through a fevered, completely disconnected monologue after being shot in a New Jersey restaurant bathroom by rivals. His last words were so strange and cryptic that police transcribed page after page of the ramblings, searching desperately for a confession or a name that never fully arrived before he died.
Carlo Gambino, the very boss who had quietly helped remove Albert Anastasia decades earlier, never once faced a bullet himself in his entire career running the family. He died peacefully of a heart attack in 1976 in his own bed at home, earning the lasting nickname the Gentle Dawn for calmly outliving nearly every single rival who had ever tried to have him killed first in a life spent avoiding exactly this fate.
From the 16-second fusillade on a lonely Louisiana highway to a quiet heart attack inside a busy airport terminal, these men all built sprawling empires on the exact same foundation of violence. And in the end, that same foundation is precisely what consumed every one of them. Some went out in gunfire and blood. Others simply rotted from within. None of them ever escaped the ledger they had spent their entire lives writing.